Fantastico. All right, here we go. Welcome to 99 Grit. It is our vision here to inspire you to chase your dreams and turn those dreams into tangible design careers. Welcome, guys. It's a Monday morning. It's 10 a.m. CET. And as usual, every Monday, we're starting off with Design Almanac, our Facebook Live event. My name is Andy, and I've been a designer of all sorts. I've started off as a visual designer, then I went into UX designer's role, then service design, all the way to then becoming a leader of teams and trying to make an impact happen at some of the bigger entities like Deloitte Digital, and now running my own agency at a training academy for designers as well. So without further ado, I wanted to first of all reach out to you and kind of get to know a little bit about you when it comes to where you're watching this from. So if you could let us know in the comments below if you're watching this live, where you're watching this from, and maybe if you're not watching this live, because we're going to be showing it around on other platforms like LinkedIn, Facebook. Just let us know in the comments, even if you're not watching this live. That'll be really cool to see where this content is actually reaching. So without further ado, I wanted to break down some of the elements of today, and we want to follow up on our design system. So as you probably are aware, if you watched our previous lives, we got into this design system process, and we're really redesigning Amazon.com. So I'm really excited to share one more element with you today when it comes to Amazon.com, which is a pretty spectacular product or a service that Jeff Bezos is providing for us for all those years. And I just wanted to break down some of the elements with you today. So let's dig right in and get into this whole thing. Just close that. And what I wanted to do is show you some of the elements of our previous endeavors when it comes to what we've outlined in the past. And the first one was actually what a design system actually is. Just a short recap of what we actually mean when we're talking about design systems and how to design those. Well, a design system, let me see if my fancy brush tool is working, that's great. So a design system is, as you can see here, let me just take maybe this pinkish color. So a design system is basically an ecosystem or an ecosystem of elements that basically are consistent within a software solution. It's a consistent way of interacting with any user base. So when it comes to when you start to design something, or if you're redesigning an existing system, it's basically to make sure that wherever that user lands in the system, whatever functionality that person actually uses, it's all consistent and it's all working. Just bear with me. I need to share our live session on my Facebook private page so we can spread the joy a little bit further into the outskirts of the galaxy. Just bear with me and I'll do that just now. Okie dokie, and there you go. So that is done, my friends and family. And another one, okie dokie. Fantastic. So going back to what we were ranting on about. And so a design system is basically a way to interact or to have a consistent interaction between your user base and any part of the system that specific person is actually using. So it's built off, as you can see, 7 elements usually. Some of the definitions are kind of vary, but to me, it's all built off these 7 elements. So typography, so all the fonts, all the styles, all the sizes, all the colors of those specific fonts. And I don't want to get into the colors because, as you can see, there's a specific element for the colors themselves. But when it comes to typography, these are all the fonts that are being used in the design or in the system, in the software. And these obviously need to be consistent so that the person actually understands what kind of level of information or the hierarchy of the information actually is. So typography is one thing. Then once we have a consistent typography right the way throughout the system, then we need to make sure that the colors that we're actually using are consistent also. So it's not like one of the systems that we've been redesigning in the past. It was a font, it was Arial typeface, which is a pretty common, it's a web safe font. Arial has been around there forever. And we were forced to use it because of some of the assumptions within the project. But we still ended up, after a year of time, we ended up with a project that was using Arial that had 161 different styles of, of colors, of gray, a little bit slighter gray, a little bit more gray, black, and a little bit less black, etc., etc. So there's so many inconsistencies and unnecessary elements in the actual style sheet that we just needed to simplify it. So colors is definitely the second thing, and we've covered some of that already. Then we go into something that we're going to be covering today in a little bit more detail, and that's spacing. So once we have a consistent typography, consistent color scheme or palette, then we need to make sure that these elements, when we start to build the components together, they're spaced appropriately and again consistently. And we'll look at some of the panels on Amazon.com to actually validate if it's happening. So once we have those three elements, then we can build components out of them. So we can use consistent typography, colors, and spacings to build components like grids, tables, panels, elements related to tabs, buttons, etc. And that allows us to actually build a list of components, and therefore later on try and put those components into templates so that we can actually do some design work and showcase what are the do's and the don'ts of our design system. And that's breaking down 5 elements already, and there are 2 additional elements that I always try to put on top, and that's the interaction models. So the micro interaction between you and the user, or the system and the user. So these are like little interactions on your buttons, or something that really makes this interface really alive. And these are obviously page transitions, anything that a user clicks on the screen that's already consistent from the perspective of the visual, but we want to make sure that the interaction is also something that is consistent. And we will get into our next live or the follow-up live into the interaction models to show you what we actually exactly mean. And the last but not least element is all the copywriting in the system. So that's everything related to how do we communicate to the user. If there's an alert or a growl or anything, or any notification out there for the user, we want to make sure that that user actually knows what we mean when we talk to them, and that we have a consistent way of structuring our thoughts. And we will cover that in detail in some future lives as well. If there are any questions, guys, just fire them up into the chat and I'll be happy to respond. And see if I can help out in any way, shape, or form. So just to recap, let's go to our panel. We've, as you probably remember, we found this panel on Amazon.com. So we went through some of the product pages, and we found this element here, which is like trading in video games, and we've got this DualShock 4 wireless controller for PS4, and the panel that we found was this one. So we're kind of going through each one of the elements using this specific panel, but there are other products on Amazon.com, and there are some inconsistencies within the product pages themselves, but I don't want to bore you with that. If you're interested in that, definitely check out our previous lives. They're recorded on YouTube, so definitely subscribe to YouTube and have these available to you so you can actually break down and see some of the elements live. Or even when you don't see them live, you can actually recap and see them on YouTube. So we're using this specific panel on the right here, so going back to our little Photoshop here, I wanted to cover some of the elements related to what we already did. And when it comes to the typography, as you can see, there's quite a few scribbles here. So we went through, as you would with any design system work, we went through the entire panel, going through each one of the fonts to highlight, the discrepancies and how many different font styles have been used. And as you can see, there's 15. I believe it's 16 because number 7 has been highlighted twice. So there's 16 different font styles on the actual panel, and this is just one panel, guys. So it's pretty substantial. So that's one. Then we went into elements related to colors, and we did the same thing. So we've checked how many different colors are actually on this panel, and we actually ended up listing out 17 different colors when it comes to the entire panel. So 16 different fonts or font styles and 17 different color styles that are covered within this one panel. So as you can imagine, it's pretty substantial. Okay, so this is basically a wrap when it comes to what we already did. Now it's time to actually get into the gist of this thing a little bit and try to break down the third element. Let me just maybe take this thing off. Where is it? The third element, which is spacing, and I'll just highlight it so that we know what we've covered. So far. Now bear with me. My Wacom is always changing the choice of this additional functionality that it has. So we're going to be covering the spacing today. So once we have listed out all the typography and all the color elements, just to make sure that we know what we're talking about, we can then go into spacing and see what kind of elements we have when it comes to spacing. So I'll maybe just take that and get rid of that. Okie dokie. There you go. And is it working? Brilliantly. Okay. So guys, the way that you actually do it is pretty similar to whatever we've been doing so far. And it's basically an inventory of all the elements and all the design decisions that somebody else did in the past when it comes to spacing of the entire panel, like you see here. And we're going to break down some of the elements. Actually, you know what? We're going to start with that one. So these panels, as you can see on Amazon.com, the entire web page kind of starts on the left-hand side over here, like you can see here, and it kind of finishes at the right-hand side over here. So it's all kind of within these. It's got these white margins on left and right, and everything else is kind of aligned in some way, shape, or form. And the way to do it, it's usually done through a column kind of grid. So I wanted to cover some of those aspects when it comes to column grids and how to use it. And the way that I usually break it down when I'm working on spacing as a design, I can show it to you in XD. And the way that you do it is you either go to View, Show Layout Grid, and this is like a full HD web viewport. So if you go to View, View, Show Layout Grid, it is going to show you the 12 columns that are on the actual layout, or you can just use a shortcut key, which is like Shift Command, and I think like one of these fancy little kind of quote signs. So this is like 12 columns, and the way that I usually break it down, one of the elements when it comes to spacing is appropriately using the columns. So we have a little bit of a white panel with some shadowing underneath it, and I just wanted to break down that when we are putting these elements together or validating or auditing any existing system, it's good to actually have a look at what kind of column system they were using. Is it 12 columns or is it something else? It's usually 12 columns, and then when we start designing these things, it's actually cool to make sure that when you are putting these elements together, you are using some sort of an assumption when it comes to your layout. And a great thing about having a column system like this, it actually allows you to keep some things spaced properly when it comes to aligning them up and making sure that it all works together perfectly. So that's like one thing. When it comes to the columns themselves, you can spread the panels over 3 columns. You can spread them over 2 columns if you like. And then just copy these bad boys over. Bear with me so you can see what I'm actually achieving through this. So that's that. You can obviously use each column for each one of those, or you can go crazy with it. Actually, okay. Or you can go crazy with it and maybe just use a system when you actually use like 4 different columns per panel, or on top of that, you can actually put something a little bit more crazy, and we're going to do like maybe 6 columns per panel. And a grid system like that dramatically helps us with actually understanding the layout grid. So as you can see here, the spacing of those elements is already creating some sort of a system of information, of prioritization. So we can kind of assume that this little element, I'm going to just highlight it maybe red, okie dokie. It seems to be a little bit more of an importance when it comes to the size of it, right? So it would seem like these 2 big panels at the very top, they seem to be the most important ones because they are the biggest. So the size matters in these kind of elements. So this is how you can easily break down some of those elements, and using a grid system like that, like 12 columns, you can definitely break down some of it. And actually, do you know what? I'll maybe we can do like a little example. Let's just take the. Let's take this element here, and I'm just gonna go like so, and I'm just gonna do just a screenshot of that. And I'll move it over here and we'll see what Amazon did when it comes to, and I'll move it to the top, bring to front, and I will also extend this a little bit so we can actually do a little bit of a example here. Where is this? So this is like macro spacing, if you like. So this is like the biggest elements, just to see what the Amazon guys actually did. And as you can see, well, it's pretty much not aligned with the grid system that I'm using. They must have used a different one. But when it comes to using a grid system like that, you can really have a lot of fun with actually playing around and then figuring out that maybe, let me just move it to the to front, and I'll maybe take just the border, which is red, so that you can see it better, and just do it this way. So as you can see, we can then try and figure out, okay, so if we would like to space it properly, we would maybe use the photograph itself and spread it over maybe 8 out of the 12 columns, right? Then we could maybe use this little element in between, and then have another element that we space out properly using the remaining 4 columns for this specific element on the right? This element that we're really tackling in detail on our design lives. So it's all about making these decisions and breaking down some of those elements according to this layout grid, for example, to make sure that whatever we are putting together, they're actually aligned and they make sense to the user as far as the hierarchy of the elements goes, the size of those elements. So that's a little bit more understandable, and it actually creates a little bit of an order when it comes to design or auditing any existing system. So the grids themselves, like 12 column grid, like I've shown you here, or any other system that actually allows you to put those things together in some sort of an order, is definitely something that I would highly recommend. And when it comes to XD, Adobe XD, the software we're usually using for prototyping or quick, rapid prototypes, it's something that really helps us out with putting these things together, spaced out properly, and the hierarchy of those elements actually works as well. So that's the first element, like a macro spacing of those things. But going back to Photoshop, once we know how those panels are going to be aligned together, what are the sizes, how many columns we're going to be covering within each one of those panels, then it's time to actually get into the gist of this thing. And I can just see if I'm on the right layer. I am. Fantastic. Okay, and then it just is a case of sitting down in front of each one of those elements on the interface, and again, creating an inventory of spacing. So spacing. Spacing. Let me just change the... Okay, cool. And I'll change the color as well into this pinkish and maybe a bluish, and there we go. So when it comes to trying to figure out the spacing, as you can see here, there's quite a few elements on the actual panel, and we've covered that in detail already when it comes to typography and the colors. But now it's time to actually look at each one of those elements. I'll use the pink one. Each one of those elements, and these are like little components, like a little component for getting less with trade-in, and then a little component to actually choose the colors, and the panel itself. So all of those elements now we need to look at from a component perspective and see how they're spaced together. So when it comes to the spacing elements, let's go from kind of top to bottom. As you can see, there's a margin here all the way down, right? And there is an appropriate amount, or is it the same one? I think that it's actually not. Let me just do it this way. So up until this place here, over here, there's like that's the first the first spacing, right? Like a margin over there. Let's see if we found something here as well. Yep. And as you can see here, there is another spacing element over here. So that's pretty much the same margin as it is on the other side. So I would say, okay, let's use this is the margin that's the same on the left and on the right hand side. But then for some miraculous reason, this has changed into this kind of spacing. So this is like spacing number 2. And it's probably, I haven't checked it, but it does seem like it's the same one. So that's like the second spacing. Then we have let me just maybe get rid of those so that it's a little bit easier for us to look at. Long term, so we found that there is a discrepancy when it comes to this spacing being 1, this spacing being 2. Right? And now we go, so this is like the vertical spacing of those elements, like the margins horizontally. Now let's go and look at the vertical elements and see, I'm sure that this is a separate one, like a different spacing. This is another one. So for some reason, this is different than this one. And I'm not sure if that's a conscious choice and a conscious decision. Then we have another element of spacing, and I'm not sure if it's the same size, so I'm just gonna go with number 5. And then we have another element of spacing over here, which is like number 6. And I'm not sure if this spacing and this spacing is equal. So I would say that, no, I think that this is actually like somebody chose another element of spacing over there, but I'm not gonna really just be too hustled with that, but it does seem like these elements have different spacing in between each other, so I would definitely check that out and see if that was a conscious choice or not. So that's like number 6. Then we go and break down this one, and I'm not sure if the spacing is here as well on the same level, so I would assume that maybe this is another one, and this would be another one. And then I would look at maybe the distance between those 2 fonts and those 2 kind of paragraphs. So that's like 9 and 10. Right? Then we go further and we are like, okay, so there's another spacing over here. So I'm not sure if any of those are kind of aligned or on the same level. I'm just listing out how many different spacings there are, and then I would go to kind of investigate and see what are the spacings in detail. It does seem like this element is pretty much the same as this one, so I'm not going to be too hustled with that. And then when it comes to this one, that's another one. And it's probably along the lines of some of those on top, but I believe that I'm not sure if this number 4 is actually the same amount as it is over here. I would need to check that, but I would still go through the entire panel and see, you know, if those elements that have been put together are the same ones. So this is like 13, 14, 15, then this one's like 16, and there's another one, a biggie. 17, and obviously there is one more spacing over here, which is like 18. So I'm not saying that they're dramatically different. They might actually be the right or reused to a certain extent, but I would definitely check. So check 18 spacing elements. And what is crucial about the spacing elements, the spacing elements element to me is that they're actually part of a module. What I mean actually is spacing module. I'm not sure if that's what it's called, but that's how I call it. It's an increment of the amount of, let's imagine, pixels that we then use as a module to actually multiply any element by. And this goes to the size of the font as well as the spacing of the elements on the actual interface. So for some, like, I don't know, Google Material, for example, the module that I would use is like 6 pixels. So I'm either using an increment of that or a multiplication of that specific module. So it's either 6 pixels, it's 12 pixels, it's 18 pixels, it's 24 pixels, it's 24 pixels, it's 30 pixels, 36, etc., etc., etc. And I use that module to calculate size of the fonts, spacing of the elements, paddings and margins, and all of those elements on the interface to make sure that, and obviously we can go the other way, so we can go like 3 pixels, so like half of the module as well. And then I just try to make sure that each one of those elements over here actually is using this specific module, right? So I go to each one of those and I have a conscious design decision saying, okay, the small ones over here, they're going to be using, let me maybe use a different one. So the small ones over here are going to be using 3, so half of the module, right? So like this one, and probably these ones, and probably these ones, and maybe this one, and maybe this one. They're going to be using module, the half of the module element. Then when I go further into the endeavor and I want to maybe have a little bit of an additional spacing when it comes to that. Maybe I'll go to some of those, oh, there's another one over here that we haven't highlighted. So I go to each one of those and I'm like, well, maybe I'll use these ones actually to use number 6. So I'm going to go and use that as a number, kind of number 6 pixel and module as a whole. So a whole module. Then I go into some of the other elements that I want to space even further, and I'm having a conscious choice about, okay, maybe these ones, maybe these should be like twice the module. So that's like number 12. Then I go to maybe this one and I'll go, okay, let's do 24 because I want to have a little bit more of a spacing in between the platform and the add to cart element and the quantities, etc., etc. So this is the kind of the exercise that I go through when I'm creating these spacing elements when it comes to the design system. So first of all, I go through each one of the panels, each one of the elements on the interface, and I list out how many different spacing elements there are, and just to have a good understanding of, if I have listed all of those, let's imagine there is 18 different spacing elements on this specific panel, then I go into each one of those, check it, and make sure that when I do redesign it, I'm using a certain module of spacing. So it's like 6 pixels, for example, and then I just go 12, 18, 24, 30, or 36, or 3 for that matter. Or if your module in your some of your designs is different, maybe 4 pixels or maybe 8 pixels, whatever that is, it's good to have that element because then you can not only use that for your spacing of the elements within your components when you're going to be starting to putting them together, but also something that you can then use for your typography, for the size of the iconography within your system. So you're going to be, okay, so the icons or the typefaces that we're going to be using, they are either 12 pixels with maybe 18 pixels line height, etc., etc., etc. So it's very good to have this kind of a module. And usually I end up with these kind of modules and this kind of a thought process within the third element of the design systems build, and that's when I'm actually working on the spacing of the elements. So that's pretty much is a wrap when it comes to the third part of the design systems kind of design. And yeah, to go through and recap some of those elements, as you remember, we've covered the typography. So that's step number 1. Let me just maybe change that into, there we go. So we have covered the typography as step number 1. List out all of the typographical elements in your interfaces. Then we go into colors. So list out all of your colors that you're using within that specific design system. And then last but not least, when it comes to the first 3 elements of the design system, see how they're aligned and spaced together. What are the margins, kind of what are the distances, in pixels if you have access to any tool like XD or Photoshop or anything, just to see what is the spacing of those elements in between each other. And that pretty much specifies those 3 elements all together, saying that, okay, so if this is what we're actually up against, we have covered the first 3 elements. So we know that we don't have a consistent typography, consistent color scheme, and the spacing remains, the quality of that decision actually leaves some room for improvement. So that's what I would definitely urge you guys to do. And when it comes to today's live, it's pretty much a wrap. So I'm really looking forward to seeing some of the comments, some of the interesting interactions that we are having on a daily basis. I'm really looking forward to seeing what you guys think. And since it's a Monday again, I wanted to put out a challenge into the world as well. And we've covered the typography, colors, and spacing. So I would urge you to actually take a project that you're currently working on and do this exercise for your project currently. Wherever that project is it at the beginning of the journey or is it at the end of that journey? Try to sit down, look at the things that you've already designed or are thinking of designing or your friends have designed, and just go through this project or through this exercise. List out all of the typography, so all of the fonts. Then list out all of the colors, and at the end of the day, for this specific week, add the third element to it and see how did those guys or yourself, when you were designing it, spaced those elements in between each other. And that goes from, as we've mentioned, from the high level kind of column grid that you've used. Is it 12 columns or is it 16 columns for some reason? And how did you space out the elements over there? And did you do that with a conscious choice? And also, when you have designed a panel together, what were the distances of the elements in between each other, just to make sure that the spacing is consistent. And let me promise you one thing: if you have done that and you have a consistent typography, color scheme, and the spacing is reasonably consistent as well, you're pretty close to having a very consistent look and feel of your design, or of the entire ecosystem of the interfaces that you're actually designing from now on. So that's a good place to be, even to start with, or even halfway through the project. It's good to have an audit like that done for yourselves, so that you're sure that you are heading into a consistent world. So take your project, check it out, let us know what you think. And yeah, this Thursday there's another thing coming. Like every Thursday, there's a webinar on design thinking masterclass. We're going to be covering the design thinking as a process as a whole, how we tackle it on a daily basis and commercially apply it. There's a brand new course on Udemy and Skillshare called Design Thinking Masterclass Bootcamp, that covers the details of how to actually tackle business hypothesis mapping. So definitely check that out. And yeah, reach out to us, subscribe to YouTube, and let us know if any of these elements kind of bring value to you. Are there any elements that you would like for us to cover in detail? We're going to be kind of continuing with redesigning of Amazon.com live, listing out all of those elements, and then at the end of the day, try to do some redesign work at the very least. So if that's interesting to you guys, definitely let us know. If you want something else to be covered, definitely let us know. And yeah, I'm really glad that some of you showed up live. That's really cool to see. And yeah, have a great week, guys, and I'm looking forward to some of the interactions. And don't be a stranger. It's going to be a legendary week, I hope, for you guys. And yeah, I'll see you around. Take care, guys.